Hey everyone, welcome back to Small Step Effects. In today's video, or as I promised in the last video, I'm back again with the hedging strategy, but this time I'm back again with approaches that actually worked. In the last video, I shared the goals that I had when trying, or rather starting, this hedging pathway, and what I found, what went wrong, and why I lost a bunch of money. So in this specific video, I'd very much like to explore the approaches that I found worked, the approaches that I'm trying to integrate in my trading now, or rather in my hedging now, and other approaches that I would recommend you guys to check out. And maybe in the future, I'll create videos for each of them and how they work. In this video, it will mostly be a demonstration kind of video where I draw on the screen and essentially explain what a specific approach entails. Some might involve math, but don't take my word for it. It will depend on whether my explanation makes sense or not. And please don't forget to comment down below on whether an explanation worked or whether you want a future video or a backtest that explores a specific situation or approach. Before we jump in, if you can hear kids playing, they're my kids. I'm basically trying to be consistent, and I can't really do that when I'm trying to prevent them either from talking or trying to postpone a future video to when they're sleeping. So I'm trying to be very intentional with the videos, and comment down below if you actually like this approach to videos, presentation based and such, without a lot of charts and all that. So with that out of the way, let's just jump in. If you are not aware of the initial strategy that got me into hedging, or rather that got me excited about hedging, please check out the videos that I'll have linked below and check out other videos in the past in as far as hedging is concerned. But essentially, this was a strategy. You hedge equally. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, but you essentially enter a buy trade if the market gave you a buy signal, and then if it goes against you, you sell, but it's equal. So if you traded one lot here, it's one lot here, and as the market goes, for instance, in your sell direction, at a specific point, you close the sell, use part of the sell to improve or rather reduce the sizing of the buy, and then you add a new sell. So assuming you have cut the buy down to 0.5 lots, you again hedge 0.5 lots or sell. I also discussed in the last video the disadvantages of this approach, potential issues related to this, and in this video I'd like to explore essentially improvements to this approach, or rather improvements that I've added to my hedging approach. For the time being, it won't really be focused on trimming. So if that's what you're interested in, please comment down below so that in the future I can explore this feature or approach to hedging specifically. But for now, I really just want to discuss the approaches that I noticed worked, the core elements and improvements that I'm making to my hedging that essentially made the winning trades, or the rather trades that I won, tick. Yeah, I know it's a lot, but bear with me. And I've just noticed this. So if you notice it, comment down below laughing at my designs, but I think I'll get better at this. I'm not really accustomed to creating a lot of presentations and all that. So, but tell me if you actually prefer this format, since it essentially just helps me to organize my thoughts so that I can discuss each one and make my videos less ranty. In any case, some of the core elements that worked, I noticed that for the trades that made sense or won, had an aspect to one of these, or all of them, or several of them. So I'll just discuss each of them and explore them and try to demonstrate what they are related to or what makes it make sense. And in the future, if you want specific videos related to each of these specific elements, please comment down below so that I can cover each of them to completion and also showcase specific examples on the charts and such. I'll still have to sit down and find examples for each of these, but I'll do that for you guys as long as you're interested in any of these approaches. So with that out of the way, let's just start. So one of the aspects that I noticed works are structured recovery zones. This is a very complex element, and while I was experimenting with this, I experienced a few losses at the start, since it was just a theory in my mind that I was thinking about. But after some time, I was able to refine it to an extent. Of course, I still experienced the losses before, so I'm just mentioning that as a disclaimer. But using such an approach had its own advantages. It was essentially based, it's not essentially just based on holding both directions. So let me start with the first one. So I can't spell, I don't know why. Structural recovery zones. As the name implies, it's based on structure, but it's essentially an approach to hedging. I actually haven't seen this anywhere else. It combines different ideas about hedging, and I'm not sure, I haven't seen this anywhere else, but if you have, please forgive me for that. It's just something that I discovered while hedging. So I noticed, or rather the approach, it's not based on holding both sides and hoping that you'll actually get to a point where you exit both, but rather it's based, or rather founded on the notion that you define a zone, a logical price range, where either the hedge or the original trade could be adjusted or closed, essentially creating breathing room and keeping the system from spiraling out of control. So I'm using recovery zones since the zone of recovery is a core element of this. If you've heard of this approach, you might already start seeing what this approach is related to. Essentially, the zone of recovery is a trading strategy whereby you define a zone, assuming the market is coming back here. Now you define a zone where you think the market might ping pong before heading in your direction. So maybe you have a bias, but then for this situation, your bias does not matter. Regardless of what the market does, you expect yourself to make money. So let me give you an example. So the market has come back here and you're expecting to buy. You buy maybe an order, let me use round numbers so that it can be easier to show you the math. Essentially, you might buy one lot. So you buy one lot. And if the market heads in your direction, you have won. If it doesn't, you sell, let's say, 2 lots here. So if the market continues heading in your direction, you will have won, because remember, there's a delta between these two sizes. But then something else might happen. The market might go higher, and at this point, you might add 3 lots. Essentially, on the buy side, you have a total of 4 lots, and on the sell side, you have a total of 2 lots. You essentially continue this. You continue this approach until such a point where the market will just break out and you win on one of the directions. So you might have already noticed that while the market is ping-ponging within this zone, you continually increase your lot size. So I first watched a video related to the zone of recovery and I realized, wait, what if I set a limit to the zone? And then once I've set a limit to how many ping-pongs that I'll accept, after that point, I then hedge. So let me bring back this. So instead of starting with, let's say, 1 lot, I know that my account can support a maximum of one lot. I'm starting with that assumption. Let's say one lot per $1,000. And instead of now risking one lot, I would risk something like 0.33, maybe. This one divided by 3, essentially. If the market heads in my direction, I've essentially won. If it doesn't and heads lower, I sell 0.67, 0.66, but I'm just rounding off. So I sell 0.67, essentially implying if the market continues heading lower, I'm still winning. Now, here is where the strategy deviates from the traditional or rather classical zone of recovery approach. Once it starts heading back to the buy side, I now hedge fully to the one lot. I add 0.67, taking this to a maximum of one lot. So the market heads higher, I've won, I've just dealt with the loss. If it then heads lower, I just hedge equally. One lot. Once it gets to the one lot marker, I'm essentially hedged, fully hedged at one lot. I can manage it either by trimming or other approaches that I'll be discussing later, the rest of the approaches. So I've essentially, number one, increased the likelihood that the market might head in a specific direction before I'm actually fully hedged. So I don't jump in with the assumption that I'll be fully hedged immediately. Additionally, this approach essentially sets an invalidation zone where if the market breaks out of this zone, I've invalidated one direction before I'm fully hedged. Once this is done, I can of course set maximum stop losses and such and other approaches that I'll definitely be recommending in as far as hedging is concerned and an approach to hedging and managing hedges are concerned. But for starters, this zoned approach helps me to set a specific zone. I'll say zone a lot of times, but essentially it sets a specific zone where if the market continues to ping pong in that specific zone, I'm essentially safe. And whichever direction it goes to, I'm safe. I created a minor script, a small script, which allowed me to automate this and see it work. So in the long run, I noticed for me specifically, for the way I trade, I just needed a maximum of this number of times, 3 touches before I am essentially hedged. But for some, it might be 6. So for those situations, you just modify your risk, your initial risk, to a level that makes sense to you. It might be 0.01 and then 0.02 and then 0.04 until you get to the one lot maximum or whatever maximum that you're setting for yourself. So you essentially allow the market to prove you wrong several times before you actually win without constantly increasing your lot size. That's an approach that you can use, and that's an approach that I tested specifically and it was working for me. So far so good. If you want me to explore this strategy more or show you a live example, please comment down below and I'll be covering it in a future video. I just don't want this video covering the different approaches to be very, very long. I just want it to be very short so that you can also internalize all the information that I'm about to dump on you. It's essentially 6, now close to 8 months worth of information of what I've been building through. Otherwise, let's move on to the next step. An equal position sizing. This is, as you might notice, I'm basically deviating away from the equal trim the hedge approach to rather an approach that is skewed on one direction. You're essentially trying to also figure out the market where it might head to next and trying to take advantage of that. But an equal position sizing essentially is based on, instead of equally sizing the buys and sell legs, you have the hedge position sized to partially cover exposure, and it's essentially staying in a dominant trend. So an equal position sizing Let me use this one instead. So assuming you see the market doing this and you're expecting it to bounce. I'm actually using break and retest because most traders are already aware of this approach to trading, and it's easy for them to conceptualize what I'm trying to discuss. So sorry to those who actually hate this approach to trading. Anyway, assuming you expect the market to bounce and continue buying, but then you expect that it could also come here and bounce. So you place your buy trade here. As an example, let's use 2 lots. And you expect the market to essentially go down at some point. You don't really expect, but rather you know that it could come to this point before heading higher. You are essentially stating that the market is likely to go higher than lower, but then it gives you an opportunity to be proven wrong for a time and then ultimately be right in the long run. So you place a buy 2 lots, but if the market breaks below here, you can sell one lot up to this point as you wait for you to be proven either right or wrong. At this point, you then observe what the market is doing, and you can close out the 1 lot sell, and you could even add, heck, you can add like 1 buy lot here if the market shows you that it's about to go higher. So you essentially play around with your hedge, not fully hedged at any given point in time, but you hedge based on the structure, partially. So depending on where the market is, you either add or reduce and play around with your hedge. Of course, this is dependent on having a specific strategy for entries, signals, and exits. I don't know what's happening to my pen. Exits. Does that make sense? Essentially, you just need to find an approach to handling specific aspects about the market. So if the market does this, I do this. But then you do it in such a way that it's unequal. You don't really jump in and fully hedge yourself out. At this point, this actually even allows you to say that if the market gets to this point, you will fully exit your buy trade, but you will have made parts of the sell. You'll have made part of it back. It's essentially a management approach. It goes back to the roots of hedging, which is managing the trade, not necessarily just hedging and gambling and betting that the market will do something, if that makes any sense. Moving on to the next thing. It's also linked to the previous idea, but this one is partial closures and re-entries. So instead of, this might be pretty weird for some, but instead of hoping that the market, let me just write it, partial closures and re-entries. Sorry for my handwriting, guys, but essentially, assuming the market is heading higher, I noticed that in certain situations, if you get a certain signal, and let's say you have bought at this point, you bought 1 lot here, and the market does its thing, it goes lower. At this point, you can partially exit the buy, you close it out, and you remain with 0.5. And at this point, you enter a sell of, it can be even equal or unequal, whichever amount, but you can say 1 lot. as you expect the market to come down here, once it gets here, remember you are hedged but unequally, and then when it comes here, you find another signal for a buy. So you buy the rest of your 0.5, close out the sell, and you ride this move. Remember, it's based on you reading the market and reading the market structure, trying to figure out whether it's volatility, moving averages, or whatever signal that you're using to determine what the market is currently doing and what it could do next. Once you get to that point, it gets easier to decide when you can partially close a trade, re-enter that same trade at a different zone, because technically at this point you're getting a better buy trade, and you essentially decide and play around with what is actually happening. You play around with the different signals that you're getting from the market. Next, timing and triggers. And before I jump into that, if any of this is unclear, please comment down below. And if you'd like a specific video related to any of these concepts, please comment down below. I'll definitely prepare chart examples where I will walk you through a specific approach, example, and all that, which would make more sense to you and would help you better understand and better test it out in different environments. Specifically, I'd recommend just backtesting this for starters and trying to check out trying to explore whether it checks out. Otherwise, timing and triggers. Essentially using time and structural triggers to reduce the psychological pressures of deciding when to hedge. So let me just draw a clock. So timing and structural triggers. Sorry about my boys, they're actually playing. If you can hear them, really sorry about that. Otherwise, timing and triggers. So something that I noticed that I was struggling with while trying to hedge was trying to determine when to exit, when to fully close a hedge, when to add to a trade, when to do other things. This is essentially a trick to hedging where I noticed I could either use structure. Here to determine this is a point where I should be buying, I should be exiting. If the market does this instead, this is a point where I should add a sell trade. Let's say I would have bought here. This is a point where I should sell. And essentially this is using structure within my hedging to essentially determine when I should take specific actions. Timing is more or less linked to essentially checking what amount of time has elapsed and what I should do next. So for instance, if I've been hedged for 3 weeks, you should be doing something. Like the amount of swap fees that you are accumulating are high. You should be doing something. So this acts as a specific signal that tells you you either should be adding more trades to cover your costs, or you should be adding more trades to help you trim down your hedge. So for instance, assuming for the past month I have been in this hedge, let's say I sold here, sell, and I have a buy. Like, yes, overall I have a specific predisposition to the market and I have a specific loss that I'm currently experiencing, but the market is here now. If I've been doing this, even if it's for a week, you set the time you want to reevaluate. After a specific period of time, you now start evaluating and thinking, at this point, I should definitely consider finding another signal. Either I should consider closing out partially both of my trades, assuming you have one lot on each. You can take, I know this is weird for me to say, but you can take a partial loss on these trades. You could even close 0.8 of each, not one side, each, so that you can take that loss and use the rest of those lots to essentially re-enter the market and find other opportunities. You still let this trade cook, but at some point, after a specific duration of time, you just realize, okay, this is not working. I need to do something else. The same applies to actually using structural triggers. If the market has been forming higher highs and higher lows, and you have a sell here, yes, you might be hedged. You might be hedged. I'm not denying that fact. But the market has been showing you that we are making higher highs and higher lows. At this point, it is just reasonable to consider at a certain point in time, let's say a breakout has occurred, you can consider waiting for the retest. You close out the sell and then you add another buy. You can decide. Like, you manage your hedge based on what the different triggers that are coming from the market. And this is an approach that I would definitely recommend you guys experimenting with. I know you could have the fear of, I can exit the sell here and then the market continues heading lower. But if you take that approach, it then implies that if you've exited, you can then use the same amount that you exited here. You can place another sell here once you get a signal. Of course, your buy is still covering the losses, but the buy that is lower, but at this point you can sell again. You're essentially offloading and reloading based on what the market is telling you. I tend to lean towards this approach as opposed to the time-based one, but I also use time at the back of my head, but to monitor fees. So swaps and commissions, but mostly swaps because these are specifically tied to time. So I monitor all these aspects and add them to my trading to make sure that I'm keeping the cost low while ensuring my likelihood for wins is way higher. So taking all these signals from the market, and this goes back to being present in the market and being aware of everything that is happening, that's essentially the approach. That's essentially the solution I would recommend for all of you. Lastly, system recovery measurements. This is something that I didn't do, but it's one of my biggest shifts and insights that I got from the duration of trading and experimenting with hedging. Everyone online will be encouraging you to measure your win rate, but something I've been shifting to is my recovery rate. So specifically, I measure how many trades or sequences it takes for me to recover after a loss. This metric told me way more than a win rate could, because something funny, if you've actually backtested this hedging strategy, you would notice that it balances at 50-50. So it's very likely you will have a 50% win rate after with a large enough sample size. With a large enough sample size, you get to about 50%. But if you essentially work through measuring the recovery instead, you can significantly improve this number by ensuring that you're constantly monitoring whether the system is recovering fast enough. Because if your recovery is low, it implies you have more fees and you are hedged more often, and it takes away the very advantage hedging purports to give, or rather hedging gives. So if these two are hitting at you, you are hedged more often, your swap fees are way higher, your recovery is very low, your psychology starts to dwindle and you start taking very bad trades. And this affected me in my 6 months of trying this out. It affected me significantly, and this is why I'm telling you, you need to start measuring your recovery. constantly observe, check on the system recovery. There's a recent back test that I did, and I'll post a screenshot here, where I essentially highlighted, and if you check on the statistics, there's essentially a point that is the measurement that I keep looking at, my recovery. I stopped focusing on my win rate, and once I did that, my win rate started improving, which is very odd. Of course, I improved other aspects about the system, but focusing on system recovery is a core element that works, and I would recommend everyone to keep monitoring that. Whether you're actually using hedging or not, just monitor your system recovery. Otherwise, these are the aspects that I noticed worked. And essentially, with these pieces in mind, I've decided to keep exploring hedging, but from a more intentional angle. The version that I'm working with right now essentially moves to a larger account. In my previous video, I explored the importance of a larger account, but I'm using a larger account in actually specifically using Darwinex 0. I'm essentially using their platform to experiment with a large account with more breathing room. Of course, it has a cost attached to it, which is a monthly subscription, and I'm using that as a psychological aspect, and the potential gains one could get as a psychological aspect to keep me grounded and keep improving my psychology in as far as trading is concerned. Additionally, I'm also using the predefined recovery zones. I've tested that out extensively, and I'm not essentially using the doubling approach, but rather using a more refined structural approach. Essentially, I'm combining the 5 aspects that I've mentioned above, or rather before that I've mentioned before, and I'm testing this out in addition to my own approach that I developed that I'm using to look at the market. Of course, this approach is one that I'm also testing using stop losses, but that is besides the point. But if you'd like to see those videos in as far as how I use stop losses and how I started to use stop losses after experiencing hedging for a time, don't forget, I'm still hedging. It's just that I also have a stop loss based account on the side that I'm monitoring. But I'm combining all these aspects, and that is essentially what I'm moving towards. But there are other aspects that I could recommend you guys to start looking at and exploring and testing out related to hedging that I haven't yet had time to fully engross myself into them. And if you'd like that, please comment down below and we can discuss all this. And I was actually thinking of having a community somewhere, whether it's a Discord server or a Telegram group where we can keep discussing all these aspects. And if you'd very much like that, comment down below and I'll be creating it so that we can start discussing all these aspects, because it's easier actually for me thinking about my day job, having kids around. It's easier for me to chat than to make videos, but it's something that I'm still exploring and thinking of ways to improve. But in any case, let me just jump into the other aspects so that we could I can essentially tell you the other aspects that you could improve and work on, and which could be helpful. I won't say they will be helpful, but they could be helpful. So I'll just quickly go through them since I'm noticing that the video is getting too long, but I'll quickly go through them, and if you'd like me to explore this further, comment down below. Otherwise, these are the interesting elements that I've noticed mentioned of online. I haven't really delved deep into them, but they sound interesting. One of them I'm actually experimenting on already, but the rest not yet. Otherwise, volatility-based hedge timing. This approach is specifically based on only hedging when the volatility is lower and in very specific zones where price tends to drift before expanding further. Of course, this is more in tune with the zone of recovery approach. So if you want to use this zone of recovery, you essentially set your recovery zones based on volatility. So you determine a specific section where the market tends to expand from. Either it's a session, for instance, the Asian session, and then you monitor how the market is reacting to that zone and you hedge accordingly, because the market would tend to expand once that session or zone is done with. So that's one approach. Additionally, you could use bias weighted trailing closures. So this is kind of linked to my structural zones approach, but it essentially takes into account that the market, you have a specific bias. And if, assuming you were buying here, and if the market goes against you a bit, you can sell, but you either size it differently, partially, a lower amount, or you essentially commit to it depending on the signals that you're getting from the market. So you essentially set a bias first, and then you use this bias to inform your decisions. So for instance, as I was mentioning here, you might sell temporarily. You might sell temporarily to essentially get the benefits of this move, but then you continue holding this position. You don't partially close it or do any of that. Additionally, you can monitor the market and realize in certain situations, so assuming the market was heading higher and you're expecting a retrace, since you have set a bias, as I mentioned, you have set a bias. So essentially, you might notice that the market is retracing. So you had already bought at this point, and you're still holding on to this trade, but you have a bias that is long, and then you sell a bit here, so that as the market is retracing, you're covering any losses that you're experiencing on this. And then when the market reverses, you continue holding on your initial trade. You close out this one. So you essentially use bias weighting and trailing. So you might trail, for instance, the sell, since you're expecting the market to reverse higher. Basically, the concept is in allowing you to continue holding on to a specific direction and play around with your exposure depending on what the market is doing. I'm not sure whether I'm explaining this one accurately, but it's just an aspect that helps you to use a bias to continue managing your exposure on either direction. You don't really jump in and explore both directions at the same time. Next is the cycle-based exposure and resets. Essentially, after a specific number of hedged trades or sequences, you reset your whole exposure and reassess. So I haven't yet used this because it doesn't seem to be like it's aligned with what the market is doing, but rather it's aligned with your actions. I tend to prefer this one because they are linked. So let me explain. The cycle-based one, so what am I doing? The cycle-based approach is based on, I have been hedged, let's say 4 times. Now I need to exit. I find it weird because the market might be ranging and I need to adapt to that, not to close my hedge. Of course, some might argue that I need to close my hedge, but this is a concept that I haven't really fully explored. The one that I'm currently exploring and trying to integrate into my system is the equity-based model, where I might be hedged buy, sell, and as the market heads higher, I find another entry and a buy, but then I want to cover this trade, so I sell if it heads lower, and then it starts heading higher. If I had a limit of 4 times, I will have already exited, unless you're counting the combination of trades, which this will be 2. But when using equity, if my equity, let's say, drops by $100, or let's say 1% or 10%, you can use percentages of values. You can close out your entire hedge, essentially taking a loss. And I find that approach to be better for me, since I have a specific aspect that I'll be monitoring, as opposed to trying to count my trades. Of course, counting my trades might also be another approach. But the problem with that approach is that I might be taking good trades, and my rules say that, you should be closing all your trades just because, let's say, I was hedged before 3 times. Of course, there are different approaches to implementing this, but I tend to prefer this. Of course, if you want me to explore this further, please comment down below. And if you want me to show more examples of this, also comment down below, and I'll be showcasing that. Lastly, there's an entry delay post hedge. Essentially, I force a waiting period or technical confirmation. So both could work. Either I wait for, once I've exited a hedge, either by winning or losing or whatever it is, once that has happened, I set a specific time or wait for a technical change or signal before retrying. So for instance, I've exited a hedge, I can say I'll need to wait 24 hours before I try again. If I've exited a hedge, I need to wait for a major structure to be taken, or rather for the market to break it before I consider re-entering. This is essentially a checks and balances approach, where you set the checks and balances that essentially state, at this point you need to stop and wait for this specific signal before retry. So that's essentially what this is about. So you might be hedging on the 1 hour, and then you wait for a daily level to break before you try to hedge once you've exited. Rather, you can also wait for 24 hours and then you try again. It essentially allows your mind to reset. I don't particularly use the approach because, again, as I mentioned in the previous video, I'm more aligned with the approach of large numbers, whereby I need large numbers for my edge to start showing and for me to actually prove it in the market. So I tend to prefer that approach. Approaches that don't necessarily limit my exposure, since I can control my exposure by reducing my risk significantly, but rather using what the market is doing. So for this specific aspect, I would rather use the technical approach, where I look at what the market is doing and use that as a signal that I should restart, as opposed to just using time. So it depends on your own take. But essentially, these are the aspects that I would recommend you guys to look into. There are checks and balances and additional factors or spices that you could add to your hedging to improve it, and they could be helpful. So I definitely recommend you checking them out. Lastly, I want to go into my lessons and conclusion. So in the past 6 months, I've explored hedging, done hedging. I have won with hedging. I have also lost with hedging. So I can say hedging isn't easy. Hedging isn't easy. Contrary to what tends to be posted, it's not 100% winning strategy. For it to actually be 100% winning strategy, you need a lot of funds and very little risk, because you need to be able to hold your trades close to a year in certain situations. I'm not saying all situations, in certain situations, for it to be a reasonably 100% or close to 100% winning strategy. So it isn't easy. All we need to do, it tends to look clean on paper, but it can get messy, especially very fast without proper controls. So as with any tool, without proper use, you can mess up. So the only thing we can do as traders is to add more checks and balances, more approaches, and different thought processes of managing your hedge. My next phase is essentially linked to this. I want to refine, to dig deeper, implement more checks and balances to the system. And it might make me an overall better, way improved version of myself being a risk manager, which we all should aspire to be. It's essential to consistent profitability. If you cannot manage your risk, you essentially get burnt out. I've showcased in the last video, and if you haven't watched it, please go and watch it. I've basically mentioned one of the reasons why I lost was in throwing risk out the window and not continuing to manage my risk, because I thought, I'm essentially safe. I've covered my losses using hedging, but that really isn't the case. You need more than that. And taking that approach has allowed me to grow to this point. I'm currently working on a funded challenge. I'm also working on a Darwinex zero account where I'm trying out a different hedging approach, and I'm also trading live. So I'm doing a lot behind the scenes, testing out different strategies, back testing. Actually, my most recent post on Twitter are results of my back testing for a month so far, January 2018. And I'll keep posting those updates. So if you don't follow me on social media, please do at Small Step FX. I'll link down my handles below. And also comment down below on what you'd like to see next and other things that you'd like me to discuss or explore. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like that Discord server or Telegram group, also comment down below, and I'd be very willing to set it up so that we can start talking about these things, start syncing up more quickly than on videos or on YouTube comments. It would be better for us and everyone all around. Definitely love the responses that I've been getting from you guys, and thank you so much for bearing with me, being patient, and allowing me to do life and this on the same page. I started this out as a way of trying to be consistent in as far as trading is concerned, being accountable, and letting you guys keeping me accountable. Thank you once again for staying on this journey with me. Please subscribe and click on the notifications bell so that you can be notified when I post next. And let's continue discussing all these aspects and try our best to keep all these things for free. Learning is free, and most of this information is actually free online. It's just that some of them I'm discovering. It was funny since I would find that I'm finding information, I'm discovering something in my backtesting and going online and finding that, oh, somebody else had already discovered this, and if I only took time to read and explore, maybe I could have found them, and it could have saved me some time. So I'm essentially using this as a platform to also post all my findings, all the things that I'm discovering, both in my trading and online as I'm reading. And I hope that this will be helpful to you guys, and it will help you improve in your trading and in the journey that we are all on. So thank you for that. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below any of your thoughts and any recommendations. If you prefer actually this presentation format, also comment down below, or if you prefer the chat based approach, I can also shift to that. All in all, it's just information that I'm trying to find different ways for making it clear to you guys and making it succinct enough for you guys to understand and be able to learn from my mistakes and my learnings. So thank you for that. Otherwise, keep a lookout for the next video, and thank you so much.